Sometimes the past finds you when you least expect it, wrapped in ice and buried beneath 50 years of silence. For Elijah Boone, an old mountain man who thought he'd made peace with his ghosts, that moment came on a bitter February morning in the Bitterroot Mountains. He'd been checking his trap lines when he spotted something strange in the ice. A crashed biplane, frozen solid like a monument to forgotten dreams. Elijah had lived alone in these mountains for decades, but nothing prepared him for what he found inside that cockpit. A leather journal, perfectly preserved by the cold. Written in handwriting he'd recognize anywhere his brother Samuel's careful script. The same brother who'd vanished during the Great War, leaving their family shattered and searching for answers that never came. Samuel was supposed to be buried in France with the other fallen pilots. So how did his journal end up in a crashed plane deep in the Montana wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pine branches like a lonesome wolf, carrying with it the scent of snow and memories that Elijah Boone had spent 50 years trying to forget. His weathered hands gripped the leather straps of his snowshoes as he made his way down the familiar ridge, following a trail he could walk blindfolded. At 73, Elijah moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that one wrong step in these mountains could be his last. The Bitterroot Range had been his home since 1918, when he'd fled here with a heart full of grief and a mind that couldn't make sense of a world without his younger brother. Back then, these peaks had offered refuge from questions he couldn't answer and condolences that felt hollow as winter wind. Now, they simply offered solitude, a commodity he'd learned to treasure more than gold. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of ancient pines, smoke rising from its chimney like a prayer against the grey February sky. Built with his own hands from timber he'd cut and stones he'd hauled, it stood as testament to what a man could accomplish when he had nowhere else to run. Elijah had constructed every beam and mortared every stone, creating something permanent in a world that had taught him how quickly everything could disappear. The trap line stretched for miles through the wilderness, a circuit that took him 3 days to complete when conditions were good. Today wasn't one of those days. The thermometer nailed to his porch had read 20 below when he'd set out at dawn, and the clouds promised more snow before nightfall. But Elijah had learned long ago that the mountains didn't care about a man's comfort. They cared about his respect, his preparation, and his willingness to accept whatever they offered. He paused at the first trap, a steel contraption designed to catch the mountain's smaller residents without causing unnecessary suffering. Empty, as he'd expected. The wildlife had been scarce this winter, driven to lower elevations by the brutal cold. Elijah reset the trigger mechanism with practiced efficiency, his fingers working despite the bite of metal against skin. He'd stopped wearing gloves years ago. They interfered with the delicate work, and numbness was a small price to pay for precision. As he moved from trap to trap, his mind wandered to memories he usually kept locked away. Samuel had been just 16 when he'd announced his intention to join the Army Air Service, his eyes bright with dreams of flight and glory. Their parents had tried to dissuade him. He was too young, too eager, too precious to risk on foreign battlefields. But Samuel had possessed the kind of stubborn determination that ran in the Boone bloodline, and by his 18th birthday he was on a ship bound for France. The last letter from Samuel had arrived. In the spring of 1918, written in his careful script from somewhere near the Western Front. He'd written about learning to fly the new Sopwith Camel, about the camaraderie among pilots, about his dreams of coming home to teach Elijah everything he'd learned about machines that could touch the sky. Then came the telegram: missing in action, presumed dead, and their world had crumbled like autumn leaves. Elijah had stayed home for the funeral, though there was no body to bury. He'd watched his mother weep over an empty casket and seen his father age 10 years in 10 minutes. The farm had fallen into disrepair as grief consumed their family like a slow fire. By winter's end, Elijah couldn't bear the weight of their shared sorrow any longer. He'd packed what he could carry, kissed his parents goodbye, and headed for the mountains where silence was honest and solitude was earned. The years had passed with the measured rhythm of seasons. He'd learned to read weather patterns in cloud, formations, to track game by the faintest impression in snow, to find sustenance in plants that others would dismiss as weeds. He'd built relationships with the few other souls, hardy enough to call these peaks home, trappers and prospectors and hermits who understood the value of a quiet word and the courtesy of not asking too many questions about a man's past. Town visits were rare affairs, usually prompted by the need for supplies he couldn't manufacture or forage. Missoula was a 2-day journey on foot, longer when snow made the trails treacherous. He'd trade pelts for coffee, ammunition, and the occasional newspaper that reminded him of a world he'd left behind. The townspeople knew him as a reliable source of quality furs and a man of few words, exactly the reputation he preferred to maintain. His family had tried to maintain contact in the early years. Letters would arrive sporadically, carried by mail riders who made the dangerous journey into the high country. His mother wrote about neighbors and harvests, about how much she missed her boys and how she prayed for their return. His father's letters were shorter, more practical updates about the farm, questions about Elijah's health, gentle suggestions that he might consider coming home for Christmas or Easter or Samuel's birthday. But grief had made Elijah selfish, and solitude had made him comfortable with that selfishness. Each letter felt like a weight pulling him back toward pain he'd worked so hard to escape. Eventually, he'd stopped responding altogether, and the letters had stopped coming. He'd learned years later, through a chance encounter with a traveling merchant, that both his parents had passed his mother in 1925, his father 3 years later. They died believing they'd lost both sons to different kinds of wars. The guilt had eaten at him for months after learning of their deaths, but by then the mountains had claimed him so completely that the thought of returning to civilization felt impossible. He'd become something wild and solitary, more comfortable with the honest brutality of winter storms than the complex emotions of human connection. The man who'd fled to these peaks in 1918 had died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone harder, quieter, and infinitely more alone. Now, as he checked the 7th trap on his line, Elijah reflected on the strange turns a life could take. He'd come to these mountains seeking temporary refuge from unbearable pain, and somewhere along the way, that refuge had become a prison of his own construction. Not that he minded, particularly prisons built of pine and granite were preferable to those built of memory and regret. The 8th trap held a surprise, a rabbit, its fur white as fresh snow, its eyes already glazed with death's peace. Elijah felt the familiar mixture of gratitude and sadness that came with taking life to sustain life. He'd never grown callous to the necessity of it, and he considered that sensitivity a mark of remaining human despite the isolation. He reset the trap and secured his catch, adding the rabbit's weight to his pack. The 9th trap sat at the edge of a small clearing where wind had carved strange sculptures from accumulated snow. It was here, as he knelt to check the mechanism, that something caught his eye, a dark shape protruding from the ice near the tree line, foreign and geometric among the organic curves of drifted snow. At first glance, he'd thought it might be a fallen tree or an unusual rock formation, but something about its angles suggested human construction. Elijah approached cautiously, his mountain-trained instincts alert for danger. What he found defied easy explanation, the twisted wreckage of what appeared to be an aircraft, its fabric wings shredded and its wooden frame splintered, but somehow preserved beneath decades of accumulated ice. The metal components had rusted to the color of dried blood, but the basic structure remained intact, as if the cold had stopped time itself. He'd seen pictures of military aircraft in the newspapers during his occasional trips to town. This looked like one of those Great War flying machines, a biplane with 2 sets of wings and an open cockpit designed for a single pilot. But what was such a contraption doing in the high reaches of the Bitterroot Mountains, hundreds of miles from the nearest airfield? Elijah circled the wreckage slowly, noting details that spoke to both the violence of the crash and the strange preservation that followed. The propeller was buried deep in snow and earth, suggesting the aircraft had struck nose first with considerable force. The landing gear was crumpled and twisted, but sections of the fuselage remained surprisingly intact. Most intriguingly, the cockpit area appeared to be protected by an overhang of ice that had formed a natural shelter. His breath came in visible puffs as he knelt beside the cockpit, brushing away loose snow to peer inside. The pilot's seat was empty, but personal effects were scattered throughout the small space. Maps, instruments, and what appeared to be personal belongings wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. Everything had the strange, suspended quality of objects trapped in time. It was then that he spotted the leather journal, wedged between the seat and the instrument panel, its surface darkened by age but otherwise remarkably well preserved. Something about its size and shape seemed familiar, though Elijah couldn't immediately place why. He reached carefully into the cockpit, his movements deliberate and respectful. This was someone's grave. After all, even if the body was absent, the journal came free with gentle pressure, and as Elijah opened the front cover, his world shifted on its axis. There, written in the careful script he'd memorized from countless letters, was a name that made his heart stop. Samuel Boone, 1st Aero Squadron, American Expeditionary Forces. His hands began to shake not from the cold, but from an emotion he'd thought buried beneath 50 years of mountain winter. He turned the page and found an entry dated just days before Samuel's reported death, but the content suggested something far different from the official story he'd been told. Samuel hadn't died in France. Somehow, impossibly, he'd made it home. As Elijah knelt in the snow beside his brother's final resting place, reading words written in a hand he'd thought silenced forever, he felt something crack open inside his chest, a part of him that had frozen solid the day the telegram arrived. The mountains around him seemed to hold their breath as he absorbed this impossible discovery, this gift of answers wrapped in 5 decades of ice and silence. But with those answers came new questions, more troubling than any he'd faced in his years of solitude. If Samuel had survived the war, why had he never come home? What had brought him to these remote peaks, so far from anywhere he belonged? And why, most troubling of all, did his journal contain entries dated years after his supposed death? The wind picked up as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, carrying with it the promise of more snow. Elijah knew he should return to his cabin before conditions worsened, but he couldn't bring himself to leave this place, this impossibility that had shattered everything he thought he knew about his brother's fate. With trembling fingers, he reached back into the cockpit, searching for more clues to this mystery that had literally emerged from the ice. His fingers found metal, tarnished and cold, but unmistakably familiar. He pulled forth a set of military dog tags, the kind issued to every soldier who served in the Great War. Even in the dim light, he could read the stamped information: Samuel J. Boone, 22841-759, Protestant, Montana. These were his brother's tags, the same ones their mother had expected to receive with his personal effects, the ones that had never been returned because his body had never been found. Now, Elijah knew why Samuel had never been buried in France, because Samuel had never died in France. Somehow, against all odds and official reports, his younger brother had survived the war, returned to America, and ended his days in these same mountains that had sheltered Elijah's grief. The irony was almost too much to bear. Both brothers had sought refuge in the same wilderness, separated by miles and decades, neither knowing how close they'd come to finding each other again. Elijah settled against a nearby pine, the journal heavy in his hands despite its modest size. The leather cover was worn smooth by handling, and as he opened to the first page, he could almost hear Samuel's voice in the careful script that had once filled letters home from training camps and foreign battlefields. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1918, just 2 weeks before Samuel's official death date. The war is ending, though not the way any of us expected. My squadron was shot down behind enemy lines 3 days ago. I'm the only survivor, and according to the Germans who found me, I'm officially dead. My identification was lost in the crash, and my face was too damaged for recognition. They've given me a choice: spend the rest of the war in a prison camp, or accept my death and disappear. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. His brother had been given an opportunity to vanish, to escape the war entirely, and he'd taken it. But why? Samuel had been brave, dedicated. Why would he choose to abandon his duty and his family? The answer came in the next entry, dated a week later. I chose death because I couldn't face life as a coward. Yesterday, I watched my best friend burn alive in his cockpit while I flew away instead of trying to save him. The enemy was waiting for rescue attempts. It was suicide to go back, but logic doesn't ease the weight of abandoning someone who would have died for me. How could I return home carrying that shame? How could I look Mother in the eyes knowing what I'd done? The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. Samuel hadn't fled because he was weak. He'd fled because he believed himself guilty of weakness. The brother who dreamed of heroic service had encountered the impossible choices that war demanded, and those choices had broken something inside him. He continued reading, finding entries that chronicled Samuel's journey through war-torn Europe as a ghost among the living. His brother had worked as a laborer, using skills learned on their family farm to earn passage across the Atlantic. By summer's end, he was in New York, but instead of heading home to Montana, he'd begun a wandering journey across the American landscape. I've been watching the farm from a distance. Read an entry from September 1918. Father looks older, and Mother spends too much time staring at the road, waiting for news that will never come. They're grieving for a son who's too much of a coward to reveal himself. I could end their suffering, but then I'd have to explain why I let them suffer in the first place. Page after page revealed Samuel's torment, a man caught between love for his family and shame over his perceived failures. He'd taken work in lumber camps and railroad construction, always moving, never settling, sending anonymous money home whenever he could, but never revealing his survival. The journal became a record of self-imposed exile, of a good man punishing himself for the crime of staying alive. As Elijah read, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the sharp scent of approaching snow. He glanced at the darkening sky and realized he was facing a choice that would have significant consequences. The weather was turning, and attempting to return to his cabin in these conditions would be dangerous. But staying meant spending the night exposed to a mountain storm that could easily kill him. It was then that he noticed something else. In the cockpit, crude but effective modifications that suggested Samuel had prepared for extended habitation. The aircraft's cabin had been insulated with animal hides and fitted with what appeared to be a small heating system using metalwork that showed considerable skill. His brother had turned the wreckage into a shelter, at least temporarily. Samuel's journal provided context for these modifications in entries dated years after the crash. The plane went down in January 1922. Elijah read with growing amazement. Engine failure in a winter storm. I was lucky to walk away. But luck runs out, and I'm too far from civilization to make it on foot. I'll have to winter here and hope for better conditions in spring. His brother had survived for years in this wreckage, using skills learned during their childhood to create a functional shelter in the wilderness. The journal chronicled his attempts to repair the aircraft, his growing realization that escape was impossible, and his gradual acceptance of his fate. But there was something else: crude drawings scattered throughout the pages, maps showing landmarks and directions that seemed to point toward specific locations in the mountains. Samuel had been searching for something, or someone, during his years of exile. I know Elijah is somewhere in these mountains. Read an entry from 1924. Mrs. Patterson at the general store in Missoula mentioned a hermit trapper who matches his description. She said he comes to town twice a year for supplies, always alone, always quiet. It has to be him. Where else would my brother go to escape the world? Elijah's hands trembled as he absorbed this revelation. Samuel had known about his presence in the mountains and had been actively searching for him. While Elijah had been hiding from memories of his brother, Samuel had been dying alone just miles away, trying to find the one person who might have understood his guilt and offered forgiveness. The maps in the journal showed an expanding search pattern, with notes about potential camping sites and trapper cabins. Samuel had spent months, perhaps years, trying to locate Elijah's refuge. Some of the marked locations were places Elijah had indeed used as temporary shelters during his early years in the mountains, before he'd built his permanent cabin. I found one of his old camps today. Read an entry from late 1924. The fire pit was built the way Father taught us, stones arranged just so, with proper drainage. Even saw marks on the trees where he'd hung game to cure. He was here, but the cold ashes suggest it's been months since he moved on. I'm always one step behind, always missing him by seasons. The irony was devastating. While Elijah had been establishing his hermitage deeper in the wilderness, Samuel had been following his trail, trying desperately to reconnect with the only family he felt worthy to face. They'd been playing an unconscious game of hide and seek across the mountains, both men wounded by the same war in different ways, both seeking solitude but for entirely different reasons. As snow began to fall in earnest, Elijah made his decision. The modified cockpit offered the best shelter for miles, and Samuel's journal suggested his brother had indeed survived winters here through careful preparation and mountain wisdom. If the weather trapped him for the night, he would at least spend it learning the truth about the brother he'd mourned for 50 years. He gathered what dry wood he could find and prepared to follow Samuel's example, using the wrecked aircraft as temporary refuge while a mountain storm raged outside. But as he settled into the space his brother had once called home, surrounded by the preserved remnants of a life he'd never known existed, Elijah felt the weight of decades of missed opportunities pressing down on him like the gathering snow. The last entry in the journal was dated December 1925, just over a year after Samuel had begun his search in earnest. The cold is getting worse, and I don't think I'll make it through another winter. If anyone finds this, please know that I tried to make things right. I tried to find my brother and ask his forgiveness for abandoning our family. I tried to come home, but shame kept me away too long, and now it's too late for everything except regret. Elijah closed the journal and looked around the small shelter that had been his brother's final home. Samuel had died here alone, just as he'd lived since the war, carrying burdens that weren't entirely his to bear, punishing himself for choices that spoke more to his humanity than his failures. And he died, searching for the very person who might have helped him understand that survival sometimes required forgiveness, especially forgiveness of oneself. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, but inside the shelter, Elijah felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 decades, a connection to family that transcended death and distance. His brother's presence seemed to fill the small space, not as a ghost to be feared, but as a companion who finally, impossibly, had come home. The storm settled over the mountains with the deliberate patience of a predator, transforming the world outside into a howling white void. Elijah arranged his bedroll in the modified cockpit, marveling at the ingenuity Samuel had shown in creating livable space from aircraft wreckage. His brother had lined the interior with carefully prepared animal hides, creating insulation that still held effectiveness after decades of abandonment. As wind drove snow against the makeshift shelter, Elijah continued reading by the light of a small lantern he'd carried for trapline emergencies. Samuel's journal entries revealed a man wrestling with demons that seemed to grow larger with each passing season of isolation. "I deserted more than the war," Samuel had written in spring of 1919. "I deserted everyone who ever believed in me, every Letter from home that I can't answer. Every birthday I miss. Every Christmas that passes without word. It's all desertion. The Germans gave me a choice between prison and freedom, but I chose a prison anyway. The only difference is that I built the walls myself. Elijah paused in his reading, recognizing the sentiment with uncomfortable clarity. He too had built walls, though his were constructed from grief rather than guilt. Both brothers had chosen exile, both had abandoned family who needed them, both had convinced themselves that isolation was somehow noble rather than selfish. The lantern light flickered across something metallic wedged behind a support beam. Elijah reached carefully into the space and withdrew a military compass, its brass surface tarnished, but its needle still responding to magnetic north. The sight of it triggered a flood of childhood memories. He'd given Samuel this very compass for his 16th birthday, teaching him to read directions and navigate by landmarks. A man's got to know where he stands before he can figure out where he's going, their father had said, watching as Elijah showed Samuel how to triangulate position using distant peaks. Samuel had treasured that compass, carrying it through training and into combat, and apparently all the way back to these mountains where he'd tried to find his way home. The compass still worked perfectly, its needle pointing steadily toward magnetic north, despite 5 decades of abandonment. Elijah turned it in his hands, remembering the weight of it when Samuel had first tried to hold it steady, the excitement in his brother's voice as he'd learned to read the markings and understand the principles of navigation. They'd spent hours that summer hiking through nearby hills, Samuel learning to use the compass in conjunction with simple maps their father had drawn of local terrain. "Promise me you'll always remember the way home," Elijah had said during one of those lessons, not knowing how prophetic those words would prove to be. Samuel had promised, but the war had taken more than his compass could restore. It had taken his certainty about what home meant and whether he deserved to find it again. The journal revealed that Samuel had used the compass obsessively during his search for Elijah, taking careful bearings and mapping his explorations with mathematical precision. Page after page contained detailed navigation notes, compass headings, and distance calculations, as Samuel had tried to systematically search every valley and ridge where a hermit trapper might choose to settle. Compass bearing 285 degrees from the tall pine struck by lightning. Read one entry. Found signs of recent human activity. Cut wood, stacked in the old way, fire pit arrangement that matches family methods, but the site is abandoned, possibly for months. He keeps moving deeper into the wilderness, always staying ahead of anyone who might try to find him. Elijah realized, with growing emotion, that Samuel had been reading the landscape like a book written in their shared childhood language. The way wood was stacked, the arrangement of fire pits, the selection of campsites, these were all skills their father had taught them, techniques that had become second nature through years of hunting and camping together. Samuel had been following a trail of habits and preferences that only a brother would recognize. The storm outside intensified, and Elijah found himself grateful for Samuel's modifications to the aircraft. His brother had demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in creating a functional shelter, using techniques that suggested years of wilderness survival experience. The heating system was particularly clever, a series of metal pipes that channeled heat from a small fire pit while venting smoke through gaps in the wreckage that had been carefully sealed and redirected. As he read deeper into the journal, Elijah began to understand the scope of Samuel's guilt and the way it had shaped his years of exile. The incident that had triggered his disappearance, watching his friend die while fleeing to safety, had become the lens through which Samuel viewed every subsequent decision. He saw cowardice where others might have seen survival instinct, abandonment where others might have seen tactical wisdom. "I keep thinking about Robert burning in that cockpit," Samuel had written. "The flames were so bright, and his screams, I can still hear them when the wind blows the right way. I had ammunition left, fuel for maybe 10 minutes of flight time. I could have tried to circle back, tried to draw enemy fire away from him. Instead, I ran. I chose my life over his, and I've been paying for that choice ever since." The entry was dated 1920, 2 years after the incident, but the pain remained as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. Elijah understood that kind of guilt, the way a single moment of perceived failure could poison decades of memory. He carried his own version of it. Guilt over abandoning his parents in their grief, guilt over choosing his own comfort over their need for support. But reading Samuel's account, Elijah began to see his brother's supposed cowardice in a different light. Samuel had been 18 years old, flying a fragile aircraft through enemy fire, watching friends die in horrible ways that no teenager should witness. The choice to flee hadn't been cowardice, it had been the reasonable response of someone who wanted to live, someone who understood that throwing his life away wouldn't restore his friends. The compass seemed to grow heavier in Elijah's hands as he considered the parallel paths their lives had taken. Samuel had spent years trying to navigate his way back to family and forgiveness, while Elijah had used the same mountains to navigate away from family and responsibility. Both men had been lost, but they'd been lost in opposite directions, Samuel seeking what Elijah had been avoiding. "I saw him today." Read an entry from late 1924 that made Elijah's heart skip, distant figure checking traplines near Bear Creek Ridge. Too far to call out, and by the time I reached the spot, he was gone. But it was definitely him, same height, same way of moving through snow, same careful attention to the country around him. Elijah is alive, and he's close enough that I could find him if I'm patient and careful. The realization that Samuel had actually seen him sent chills through Elijah that had nothing to do with mountain cold. His brother had been closer to finding him than either of them had known, close enough to observe and recognize, but not close enough to make contact. How different their lives might have been if Samuel had called out, if the distance hadn't been quite so great, if timing had aligned just slightly better. The journal entry continued with details that proved Samuel had indeed spotted him. He was using the old trail system Father taught us, moving with the efficiency I remember from our hunting trips. He looked older, more weathered, but he carried himself with the same quiet competence that always made me feel safe when we were children. I wanted to call out, but what would I say? How do you explain 50 years of letting people think you're dead? Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the small shelter, Elijah felt surrounded by the presence of a brother who had never stopped trying to come home. The storm's fury drove Elijah deeper into the shelter, where he discovered that Samuel's modifications extended beyond simple survival necessities. His brother had created storage spaces within the aircraft's structure, carefully waterproofed compartments that preserved belongings with remarkable effectiveness. It was in one of these hidden spaces that Elijah found something that stopped his breathing entirely. A photograph, protected by oiled cloth and nested between two pieces of wooden planking. Even in the lantern's dim light, he recognized the image immediately, their family's last portrait together, taken just before Samuel's departure for military service. Their parents stood in the center, dignity and pride evident in their formal poses, while Elijah and Samuel flanked them with the easy confidence of young men who believed the world held nothing but promise. Elijah's fingers traced the familiar faces, noting how the photograph had been handled extensively, edges worn soft, corners slightly bent from repeated viewing. Samuel had carried this image through war, through years of exile, through decades of isolation in these mountains. While Elijah had fled from reminders of family, Samuel had clung to them as anchors against despair. The back of the photograph bore an inscription in Samuel's hand: "The people I failed, the life I abandoned, the love I didn't deserve to keep." Those words hit Elijah like a physical blow. Samuel had viewed himself as a failure, while Elijah had spent 50 years mourning him as a hero. The brother who dreamed of bringing honor to the family name had convinced himself he'd brought only shame, carrying guilt for choices that any reasonable person would have understood as survival instinct. Elijah turned back to the journal, finding entries that revealed the depth of Samuel's self-condemnation and his desperate desire to make amends for perceived failures. I watched Father's funeral from the ridge above the cemetery, read an entry from 1928. He looked smaller in that coffin than I remembered, and Mother seemed lost without him. I counted 17 people at the service, neighbors, who remembered him as a good man, a hard worker, someone who deserved better than losing both sons to different kinds of wars. I wanted to go to Mother, to tell her that at least one son was still alive, but how could I explain why I'd let her mourn for nothing all these years? The entry was written in handwriting that seemed less steady than earlier entries, as if emotion had affected Samuel's usually careful penmanship. Elijah could picture his brother crouched among the trees, watching their father's burial from a distance, wrestling with the choice between revelation and continued concealment. Samuel had chosen concealment, but the cost of that choice seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. I should have gone to him before he died, continued the entry, should have explained about the war, about the choice I made, about why I couldn't come home carrying that shame. He would have understood. Father always understood the difficult choices men sometimes have to make, but I was too proud, too afraid, too convinced that my failures had poisoned any right I had to family comfort. Reading these words, Elijah began to understand how completely Samuel had misjudged both their parents' capacity for forgiveness and his own need for redemption. Their father had indeed been understanding about difficult choices. He'd accepted Elijah's departure for the mountains without condemnation, sending letters that spoke of love rather than disappointment. Samuel could have come home at any time and been welcomed with relief rather than judgment. The photograph seemed to grow heavier in Elijah's hands as he absorbed this tragic irony. Both brothers had overestimated their family's expectations and underestimated their family's love. Samuel had hidden from judgment that would never have come, while Elijah had fled from responsibilities that could have been shared rather than shouldered alone. Further entries revealed that Samuel had also attended their mother's funeral in 1930, again watching from a distance, again choosing observation over participation. His description of that day was particularly heartbreaking in its detail. Mother looked so small in her black dress, so fragile without father's arm to lean on. Mrs. Henderson from next farm had to help her walk to the graveside. I counted. Even fewer people this time. The community was scattering, farms being abandoned, young people leaving for cities that promised easier lives. Mother was being buried not just by her husband, but by a way of life that was disappearing. The entry continued with observations that showed Samuel's intimate knowledge of neighbors and community members, details that could only have come from years of careful watching. She carried a letter in her hand during the service. I could see it from my hiding place in the oak grove. I think it was the last one I wrote from France, the one where I promised to come home and teach Elijah everything about flying. She was buried holding promises I never kept, words I wrote when I still believed I was worthy of keeping them. Elijah set the photograph aside carefully and leaned back against the aircraft's modified seat. The storm outside continued its assault, but he barely noticed the sound of wind and snow against the shelter. His mind was occupied with the devastating realization of how close he and Samuel had come to finding each other, how many opportunities for healing had been lost to pride and misplaced guilt. The journal revealed that Samuel had known about Elijah's occasional trips to Missoula for supplies and had actually tried to time encounters that might seem accidental. Several entries described plans to accidentally encounter Elijah at the general store or the trading post, but each plan had been abandoned at the last moment as Samuel lost courage or convinced himself that Elijah was better off believing his brother dead. I saw him at Patterson's store today. Read an entry from 1932. He looked good, weathered, but healthy, competent in the way that comes from years of successful survival. He was trading pelts for coffee and ammunition, speaking quietly with Mrs. Patterson about weather conditions in the high country. I wanted to walk through that door more than I've ever wanted anything, but what right did I? We have to disrupt the peace he'd found. What right did a dead man have to demand forgiveness from the living? The logic was heartbreaking in its twisted consideration for Elijah's well-being. Samuel had convinced himself that revealing his survival would be an act of selfishness, a disruption of the healing that he assumed Elijah had achieved through solitude. He'd had no way of knowing that Elijah's solitude was its own kind of prison, that his older brother was also trapped by grief and guilt and missed opportunities for connection. As the night deepened and the storm continued its assault on the mountains, Elijah found himself surrounded by evidence of a love that had never died, despite 50 years of separation. Samuel had carried their family photograph through decades of exile, had watched over their parents from a distance, had searched tirelessly for the brother he'd never stopped hoping to find. And Elijah had been doing his own kind of searching, fleeing from memories that hurt too much to bear, but also preserving skills and values that their father had taught them both. Dawn brought a temporary lull in the storm, and with it, enough light for Elijah to explore the aircraft wreckage more thoroughly. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he understood about his brother's final years. The modifications to the shelter were far more extensive and sophisticated than he'd initially realized, suggesting Samuel had possessed engineering knowledge that went well beyond basic survival skills. Hidden beneath a carefully concealed panel in the aircraft's floor, Elijah found Samuel's flight logbook, a leather-bound record that documented not just his military service, but years of civilian flying that had apparently continued long after his supposed death. The entries began in 1918 with standard military notation, but continued through the 1,920 seconds with increasingly detailed records of flights across the American West. The logbook revealed that Samuel hadn't been simply a competent pilot, he'd been exceptional. His military records showed 43 confirmed victories over German aircraft, making him one of the most successful fighter aces of the war. Mission reports detailed acts of heroism that contradicted completely his own assessment of his service as cowardly failure. Engaged enemy formation of 6 aircraft over Belleau Wood. Read one official report copied into the logbook. Lieutenant Boone single-handedly held off enemy fighters while damaged Allied aircraft escaped to friendly lines. His actions saved the lives of 4 Allied pilots and prevented the loss of valuable intelligence regarding enemy troop movements. Elijah studied entry after entry, documenting similar heroics. Samuel had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Silver Star, and several commendations for valor under fire. The man who'd convinced himself he was a coward had actually been among the most decorated pilots in his squadron. The supposed act of cowardice, fleeing when his friend was shot down, had occurred during his final mission, after months of repeatedly risking his life to save others. The civilian entries began in 1919 and painted a picture of Samuel's life that was far more complex than the simple hermit existence Elijah had imagined. Samuel had worked as a mail pilot, flying supplies to remote locations across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. He'd earned money delivering medicine to isolated communities, transporting officials to distant mining camps, and carrying emergency supplies to areas cut off by weather or terrain. Flight to Bear Creek Mining Camp, read an entry from 1921. Delivered medical supplies for pneumonia outbreak. Dr. Harrison reports 7 lives saved due to rapid delivery of antibiotics. Payment was modest, but the work feels meaningful, finally using flying skills to help rather than harm. The logbook revealed that Samuel had been quietly serving his community for years, using aviation to provide services that would have been impossible by ground transportation. He'd helped fight forest fires by spotting and reporting blazes, assisted in search and rescue operations, and maintained communication links between remote settlements and the outside world. But the entries also documented the increasing mechanical problems with Samuel's aircraft, an aging biplane that he'd purchased surplus from military disposal and modified for civilian use. By late 1924, maintenance notes showed growing concern about engine reliability and structural integrity. Engine running rough. Suspect cylinder problems. Read an entry from December 1924. Aircraft is beyond safe operational limits, but cannot afford replacement or major repairs. Will attempt one final flight to deliver winter supplies to Glacier Creek Settlement, then retire aircraft permanently. That final flight had been scheduled for January 15th, 1925, the same time frame when Samuel's journal entries indicated the crash had occurred. What should have been a routine supply run had become Samuel's final journey, ending in the remote mountains where his aircraft finally succumbed to the mechanical problems that had been building for months. The technical details in the logbook showed that Samuel hadn't crashed due to pilot error or poor judgment. He'd been flying a barely airworthy aircraft on a mission of mercy, trying to deliver critical supplies to people who would have faced starvation without his help. The crash had been the result of mechanical failure, not any lack of skill or courage on Samuel's part. Elijah found additional documentation that painted an even more heroic picture of his brother's civilian service. Letters from grateful communities, newspaper clippings about successful rescues, and official commendations from territorial authorities all testified to Samuel's reputation as a skilled and reliable pilot who took dangerous missions that others wouldn't attempt. Samuel Boone has once again demonstrated the finest qualities of American aviation. Read a letter from the territorial governor dated 1923. His courage in flying medical supplies through mountain storms to reach the influenza outbreak at Silver Creek undoubtedly saved dozens of lives. The territory is fortunate to have such dedicated aviators serving our remote communities. The letter was signed by officials Elijah recognized from newspaper accounts, men who'd later become prominent political figures in Montana's statehood movement. Samuel had been known and respected at the highest levels of territorial government, valued for his willingness to attempt flights that pushed the boundaries of both aircraft capability and pilot skill. But perhaps most revealing was a section of the logbook that documented Samuel's systematic search for Elijah, beginning in 1924. Flight plans showed aerial reconnaissance missions over the Bitterroot Range, with detailed notes about potential hermit camps and trapper activities observed from the air. Spotted smoke from cabin in Eagle Valley. Read one entry. Configuration and location match probable trapper camp. Will investigate on foot during next supply run to determine if occupant might be Elijah. The aerial searches had given Samuel advantages that foot-based searches couldn't provide: the ability to cover vast areas quickly, to spot signs of human activity from above, and to map potential locations for more detailed ground investigation. He'd been using his pilot skills in the same methodical way he'd once used them for military reconnaissance, applying professional expertise to the deeply personal mission of finding his lost brother. The logbook also revealed why Samuel had never successfully made contact despite several near-miss encounters. His flight schedules had been dictated by weather, aircraft availability, and the emergency needs of remote communities. By the time he could follow up on promising aerial sightings with ground searches, Elijah had often moved on to different locations, returned to Eagle Valley cabin site. Read a frustrating entry from late 1924. Structure appears abandoned for several weeks. Found evidence of recent occupation: properly banked fires, organized equipment storage, game preparation area arranged according to family methods taught by father. Definitely Elijah's work, but he's moved deeper into wilderness. Will expand search pattern on next available flight. As Elijah absorbed these revelations about his brother's true character and accomplishments, he felt a complex mixture of pride, regret, and profound sadness. Samuel hadn't been the failed coward he'd believed himself to be. He'd been a genuine hero who'd spent years serving others while carrying undeserved guilt about a single moment of survival instinct during wartime. The tragedy wasn't just that Samuel had died alone in the mountains. It was that he'd lived alone with a completely false, the understanding of his own worth and the love that awaited him if he'd ever found the courage to come home. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the mountains wrapped in pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning sun. Elijah emerged from the aircraft shelter to find himself in a transformed landscape, every tree and boulder sculpted by wind into abstract art. The beauty was breathtaking, but his mind remained focused on the mysteries hidden within Samuel's makeshift home. Systematic exploration of the wreckage revealed compartments he'd missed in the previous evening's dim light. Samuel had been remarkably thorough in creating storage solutions, using every available space within the aircraft's structure to preserve belongings and supplies. It was in the largest of these compartments that Elijah made his most emotionally devastating discovery. A bundle of letters, each carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with string that had somehow maintained its integrity despite decades of mountain weather. The bundle was substantial, dozens of letters that Samuel had written but never sent, addressed to various family members and bearing dates that spanned more than 30 years. The first letter was addressed to their mother and dated just weeks after Samuel's supposed death. "Dear Mother," Elijah read, his voice barely a whisper in the crystal air, "I am alive and well, though I cannot come home yet. The war changed me in ways that make me unfit for the family I left behind. Please don't grieve for me instead. Remember the boy who left home with dreams of flying, not the man who learned that some dreams cost more than their worth." The letter continued for several pages, filled with expressions of love and detailed questions about family life that showed Samuel's desperate hunger for connection despite his self-imposed exile. He'd asked about the farm's harvest, about their father's health, about neighbors and community events that mattered to people who belonged somewhere. Elijah found letters to their father that revealed Samuel's deep respect for the man who'd taught both brothers how to read the land and survive in wilderness conditions. "I use your lessons every day," Samuel had written in 1920. "The way you taught us to find shelter, to preserve food, to read weather patterns in cloud formations. Those skills have kept me alive when machinery failed and civilization seemed impossibly distant. You raised sons who could survive anything, even when we chose survival over honor." There were letters addressed to Elijah himself, and reading them was almost unbearable in their raw honesty and desperate longing for reconciliation. "Dear brother," began a letter dated 1923. "I know you went to the mountains to escape the pain of losing me, but I'm not lost. I'm just hiding. Every day I think about the compass you gave me, about the lessons we learned together, about finding our way through unknown country. I've been lost since the war ended, but I think I know the direction home. I just don't know if I'm brave enough to follow it." The letter continued with memories of their childhood adventures, hunting trips where they'd learned to depend on each other, quiet evenings when they'd planned futures that seemed guaranteed and bright. Samuel's handwriting grew less steady as he described his guilt over abandoning those shared dreams and the brother who'd believed in them. Another letter to Elijah, dated 1924, revealed the depth of Samuel's knowledge about his brother's mountain exile. "I've been watching you from a distance, and I'm proud of the man you've become. You move through the wilderness with the competence Father always said you'd develop, and you've built a life that's honest and self-sufficient. I sometimes think you're better off believing I'm dead than discovering what I've become, a man too proud to admit his mistakes, too ashamed to ask forgiveness, too stubborn to accept love he doesn't think he deserves." The letters revealed that Samuel had maintained detailed knowledge about not just Elijah's activities, but the entire community they'd left behind. He'd written about neighbors' marriages and deaths, about changes in the local economy, about political developments that affected rural Montana. Somehow, despite his physical isolation, Samuel had maintained an extensive network of information that kept him connected to the world he'd abandoned. Letters addressed to childhood friends showed Samuel's awareness of how completely his disappearance had affected the entire community. "Dear Jim," he'd written to their neighbor's son, who'd also served in the war. "I heard you made it home safely and married Sarah Patterson like you always planned. I'm glad the war didn't steal your capacity for normal life the way it stole mine. Sometimes I think about showing up at your wedding or your farm, but what would I say? How do you explain to people who mourned you that you chose to let them suffer rather than face their disappointment?" The most heartbreaking letters were those addressed to their parents during their final illnesses. Samuel had been aware of their failing health and had wrestled with the decision to reveal himself in time to say goodbye. "Dear Father," read a letter written just before their father's death. "I know you're dying, and I know I should come to you. A son belongs at his father's bedside, offering comfort and asking forgiveness for the pain he's caused. But I'm afraid that seeing me would hurt you more than my absence. You raised me to be honorable, and I became something else entirely. Let me remain dead in your memory at least. That version of me never disappointed you." Similar letters to their mother during her final months showed Samuel's agonizing internal debate about revelation versus concealment. He'd wanted desperately to comfort her, but had convinced himself that his survival would create more pain than healing. As Elijah read letter after letter, he began to understand the scope of Samuel's emotional imprisonment. His brother had created a circle of self-reinforcing guilt that made every choice seem wrong, every potential action seem selfish or harmful. Samuel had convinced himself that love required absence, that the greatest gift he could give his family was the continued belief in his noble death. The final letter in the bundle was addressed to no one in particular and dated just days before Samuel's death. "To whoever finds these words," it began. "I tried to live with honor after failing to die with it. I spent 30 years serving people who needed help, flying missions that mattered, using skills learned in war to preserve life rather than destroy it. But I never found the courage to serve the people who mattered most, my family. If someone reads this, please know that my greatest regret isn't dying in these mountains. It's living in them while better. People mourned a death that never happened." Elijah folded the letter carefully and sat in the snow beside his brother's final resting place. Samuel had been wrong about almost everything. Wrong about his cowardice, wrong about his family's capacity for forgiveness, wrong about the burden his survival would have created. But he'd been right about one thing. He'd spent 30 years serving others with courage and dedication, using his skills to preserve life and provide hope to remote communities that desperately needed both. The tragedy wasn't just that Samuel had died alone, it was that he'd lived alone, carrying burdens that could have been shared and guilt that could have been healed through the very family connections he'd been too afraid to reclaim. As Elijah prepared to gather his belongings and return to his cabin, something about the aircraft's cargo compartment caught his attention. What he'd initially assumed was structural damage revealed itself as deliberate. Modification panels that had been carefully removed and replaced, creating hidden storage spaces that weren't immediately visible even to thorough inspection. The discovery of these concealed compartments would have been remarkable enough, but what lay hidden within them defied everything Elijah thought he understood about his brother's life and the timeline of his death. Wrapped in waterproof materials and secured with military precision was equipment that belonged to no 1,920 aircraft. Sophisticated radio gear that gleamed with the unmistakable hallmark of modern manufacturing. Elijah examined the radio equipment with growing bewilderment. The components were clearly designed for long-range communication, far beyond anything a civilian male pilot would need. Serial numbers and manufacturer markings indicated production dates in the early 1960s, decades after Samuel's supposed death in the aircraft crash. Hidden beneath the radio equipment, Elijah found documentation that transformed his understanding not just of Samuel's death, but of his entire post-war existence. Official government papers bearing the seal of agencies he didn't recognize, communications logs that referenced operations with code names like Mountain Watch and Silent Eagle, and mission reports that described activities far removed from simple mail delivery flights. The documents revealed that Samuel Boone hadn't died in 1925, as his journal suggested. He'd lived well into the 1960 seconds, conducting covert operations for the United States government under an identity that officially didn't exist. His supposed death during the Great War hadn't been tragedy, it had been opportunity, a chance to create an operative who could function outside normal diplomatic and military channels. A personnel file contained Samuel's actual service record, far different from the simple pilot history Elijah had discovered in the flight logbook. After his supposed death in France, Samuel had been recruited by an unnamed government agency to conduct intelligence operations across the American West and into Mexico. His aviation skills and presumed dead status made him ideal for missions that required absolute deniability. Subject demonstrates exceptional capability for independent operation in remote terrain. Read one evaluation report. His background as presumed Kia provides perfect cover for long-term assignments requiring minimal official oversight. Recommend continued deployment for operations requiring extended isolation and autonomous decision-making. The missions documented in Samuel's files painted a picture of a man who'd spent 40 years serving his country in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. He'd conducted surveillance operations along the Mexican border during Prohibition, monitoring smuggling operations and gathering intelligence about cross-border criminal activity. During World War II, he'd operated deep cover missions, watching for German and Japanese agents attempting to infiltrate through remote mountain passes. The Cold War had brought new assignments, monitoring Soviet activities in the Pacific Northwest, tracking potential communist infiltration of mining and lumber operations, and maintaining communication networks that could function independently of normal infrastructure. Samuel had become America's ghost in the mountains, a man who officially didn't exist, but whose work protected national security in ways the public would never know. Mission reports revealed the scope and danger of Samuel's assignments. He'd prevented sabotage attempts against strategic railways, gathered intelligence about foreign agents operating under diplomatic cover, and maintained safe houses for other operatives conducting classified missions. His presumed dead status had been his greatest asset. A man who didn't exist couldn't be compromised by normal intelligence countermeasures. But the files also revealed the personal cost of Samuel's secret life. Psychological evaluations from the 1950 seconds documented his growing isolation and the emotional toll of maintaining his fictional death while serving family and country in ways neither could acknowledge. Subject shows signs of significant emotional strain related to separation from family, noted one report from 1954. Recommend psychological evaluation and possible reassignment to operations requiring less personal sacrifice. Samuel had apparently refused reassignment, continuing his mountain operations even as the emotional burden grew heavier with each passing year. Communications logs showed that he'd maintained covert surveillance of his family throughout his career, using his intelligence network to monitor their safety and well-being from a distance. The most shocking revelation came in a file labeled Project Family Shield, an operation specifically designed to protect the Boone family from potential threats related to Samuel's classified activities. Soviet intelligence had apparently identified Samuel's true identity in the late 1950 seconds and had planned to use his family as leverage to compromise his operations. Samuel's final missions had involved protecting his family from foreign agents who'd traced his identity through painstaking intelligence work. He'd used his knowledge of mountain terrain and his network of safe houses to lead enemy operatives away from populated areas, drawing them into increasingly remote regions where they could be dealt with without civilian casualties. The last mission report, dated just weeks before Samuel's actual death, described a final confrontation with Soviet agents who'd tracked him to the Bitterroot Mountains. Samuel had been carrying critical intelligence about communist activities in the Pacific Northwest when his aircraft was shot down by enemy operatives who'd finally cornered America's most elusive ghost agent. Radio contact lost during Operation Final Flight. Read the report. Agent Phantom, believed to have successfully delivered critical intelligence to designated dead drop before aircraft destruction. Enemy operatives eliminated during engagement, but agent presumed killed in action. Recommend posthumous commendation for extraordinary service to national security. Elijah found the referenced dead drop location marked on a detailed topographical map that Samuel had prepared as part of his final mission. Planning. The site was marked with symbols that meant nothing to civilian eyes, but indicated the presence of materials critical enough to justify Samuel's ultimate sacrifice. The radio equipment in the aircraft had been Samuel's final communication link with his handlers, allowing him to coordinate his last mission and ensure that critical intelligence wouldn't be lost, even if he didn't survive to deliver it personally. His crash hadn't been mechanical failure. It had been enemy action during his most important assignment, a final document in the file provided. Context for Samuel's entire post-war career. A letter of commendation from the Director of Central Intelligence, acknowledging Samuel's 4 decades of service and sacrifice. Agent Samuel Boone, operating under cover designation Phantom, has provided extraordinary service to United States security interests over a 40-year period. His willingness to maintain deep cover status, including separation from family and normal social connections, represents sacrifice of the highest order. His final mission prevented foreign acquisition of intelligence that could have compromised national security for decades. The United States owes Agent Boone a debt that can never be publicly acknowledged, but will never be forgotten. The letter was dated 3 days after Samuel's actual death and signed by officials whose names Elijah recognized from newspaper accounts of Cold War intelligence operations. His brother hadn't been a failed hermit carrying guilt over wartime cowardice. He'd been one of America's most valuable intelligence assets, a patriot who'd sacrificed everything for country and family. As Elijah absorbed this revelation, he realized that Samuel's journal entries about guilt and shame had been deliberate misdirection, a cover story designed to protect his true activities, even from family members who might accidentally discover his mountain refuge. The brother he'd mourned as a tragic failure had actually been a national hero whose service would remain classified long after both of them were gone. The mountains around him seemed to hold new significance as Elijah understood that Samuel had chosen this remote location not just as exile, but as a strategic base for operations that had protected American interests for 4 decades. Every valley and ridge had been Samuel's workplace, every hidden trail, part of a network that had kept the nation safe from threats most citizens never knew existed. Among the intelligence documents, Elijah discovered something that made his hands shake with more than mountain cold, an encrypted message decoder, its metal surface bearing scratches and wear that spoke of extensive use. Unlike the other equipment, this device had been positioned for easy access, suggesting Samuel had been using it regularly, even in his final days. The decoder was more complex than the radio equipment, its dials and switches arranged with military precision around a central viewing screen that remained dark but functional. A small instruction manual, written in Samuel's careful handwriting, explained the basic operation procedures, along with security protocols that emphasized the critical nature of any messages the device might reveal. Following Samuel's instructions, Elijah powered the device using the battery system his brother had rigged within the aircraft. The screen flickered to life, displaying a message queue that contained dozens of encrypted transmissions dating from the weeks before Samuel's death through several days. Afterward, communications that had continued arriving even after the agent who was supposed to receive them had been killed. The first decoded message was dated 5 days before Samuel's final flight and marked with the highest classification level. As the decoder revealed its contents, Elijah understood why his brother's last mission had been worth dying for. Urgent, Soviet deep penetration network discovered in Pacific Northwest timber industry. Operative Red Pine has identified critical intelligence regarding planned sabotage of strategic lumber operations supporting military construction projects. Intelligence includes names, locations, and timetables for coordinated attacks on infrastructure supporting national defense. Agent Phantom authorized to retrieve and protect intelligence at all costs. Subsequent messages revealed the scope of the threat Samuel had been assigned to counter. Soviet agents had spent years infiltrating logging operations that provided materials for military bases and defense installations. Their plan involved simultaneous sabotage attacks that would cripple America's ability to construct and maintain facilities crucial to Cold War defense strategy. Red Pine reports elimination imminent. Soviet counterintelligence has identified our asset and dispatched termination team. Agent Phantom must secure intelligence cache before enemy acquisition. Location: Eagles Rest Summit. Coordinates follow. Caution: enemy operatives armed and extremely dangerous. The messages painted a picture of Samuel's final days that was far different from the peaceful hermit existence Elijah had imagined. His brother had been engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with professional killers, using his intimate knowledge of mountain terrain to stay ahead of enemies who'd spent months tracking him through the wilderness. Enemy team consists of 4 operatives with extensive mountain warfare training. Read another message. They have been tracking Agent Phantom for 3 weeks, using information obtained through Red Pine interrogation. Recommend immediate extraction or full tactical support. Agent should not attempt solo engagement. Samuel's response, transmitted through his radio equipment, demonstrated the courage and dedication that had defined his entire intelligence career. Extraction impossible due to weather conditions and enemy positioning. Will proceed to secure intelligence cache as assigned. If communication ceases, assume mission successful and agent status KIA. Request family protection protocols remain active indefinitely. The final exchange between Samuel and his handlers revealed the impossible choice he'd been forced to make between his own survival and the success of a mission that could affect thousands of American lives. Agent Phantom, you are authorized to abandon mission if personal safety compromised. Intelligence important, but not worth agent sacrifice. Repeat, you are authorized to withdraw. Negative on withdrawal. Intelligence too critical for enemy acquisition. Will complete mission as assigned. Personal considerations secondary to national security. Request official death notification. Be prepared, this may be final transmission. Reading these final communications, Elijah began to understand the true nature of Samuel's sacrifice. His brother hadn't died accidentally while flying mail to remote settlements. He died deliberately, choosing mission success over personal survival in the finest tradition of military service. The decoder held one final category of messages that transformed Elijah's understanding of his own role in Samuel's story. Encrypted communications dating back 15 years revealed that Samuel had been secretly protecting his family through his intelligence network, using government resources to monitor potential threats and ensure their safety. Family protection update. Subject Elijah Boone continues mountain residence with no awareness of apparent surveillance. Potential Soviet interest noted but assessed as minimal threat. Recommend continued monitoring but no direct intervention unless threat escalates. Samuel had been watching over him for decades, using his intelligence position to ensure that his hermit brother remained safe from the same forces that eventually claimed Samuel's life. The isolation Elijah thought he'd chosen for himself had actually been carefully maintained through Samuel's covert protection. Additional messages revealed the extent of Samuel's family surveillance network. He'd maintained contacts with local law enforcement, territorial officials, and even merchants in Missoula to ensure any threats against family members would be detected and countered before harm could occur. Local asset reports unusual interest in Elijah Boone, from strangers asking questions at trading post. recommend heightened surveillance and preparation for potential protective intervention. Family remains highest priority, regardless of operational requirements. The messages suggested that Samuel had occasionally intervened directly to protect Elijah from dangers he'd never known existed. Predators, both human and animal, that had been quietly discouraged or eliminated before they could pose genuine threats to a hermit trapper who had no idea he was under professional protection. But the final messages in the decoder revealed a chilling development. The same Soviet agents who'd killed Samuel had been tasked with eliminating all potential sources of intelligence about their infiltration network, including family members who might possess information about Agent Phantom's activities. Warning: enemy operative team has been authorized to eliminate all family connections to Agent Phantom. Subject: Elijah Boone, assessed as potential intelligence source requiring termination. Agent Phantom must secure family protection before completing primary mission. Samuel's final days had involved an impossible tactical situation, completing his assigned mission while simultaneously protecting his brother from enemies who viewed Elijah as a potential security threat. The intelligence cache he'd been ordered to secure contained information that could save thousands of lives, but reaching it meant leaving Elijah vulnerable to Soviet operatives who'd been instructed to kill anyone connected to the Phantom network. The solution Samuel had chosen demonstrated both his tactical genius and his absolute devotion to family. Rather than attempting to complete his mission quickly and efficiently, he'd deliberately drawn the enemy operatives away from populated areas and into the most remote sections of the Bitterroot Range, using himself as bait to protect both his brother and the innocent civilians who might be harmed during the confrontation. His final flight hadn't been a simple intelligence retrieval mission. It had been an elaborate tactical maneuver designed to eliminate enemy threats while securing critical national security intelligence. Samuel had planned his own death as carefully as he'd planned 40 years of covert operations, ensuring that his sacrifice would achieve maximum strategic benefit. The coordinates for the intelligence cache were encoded in the final message, along with detailed instructions for its recovery and proper delivery to government handlers. Samuel had intended his mission to be completed, even if he didn't survive to complete it personally, and he'd left precise protocols for authorized personnel to locate and secure the intelligence he died protecting. But the instructions included a personal message that revealed Samuel's final thoughts about his family and his hope for eventual reconciliation, even beyond death. If family member locates this equipment, understand that 40 years of separation were service, not abandonment. Intelligence cache contains proof of dedication to country and family. Request delivery to proper authorities. With explanation of Agent Phantom's true record. Family deserves to know that death came with honor, not shame. As Elijah absorbed the full scope of Samuel's final mission and the sacrifice it had required, he realized that his discovery of the aircraft wreckage hadn't been accidental. Samuel had positioned his final refuge along one of Elijah's trap lines, ensuring that his brother would eventually find the evidence needed to understand the truth about their separation and Samuel's ultimate service to both family and country. The decoded messages revealed not just a mission that had ended in Samuel's death, but a mission that could still be completed if someone else possessed the courage and determination to follow Samuel's carefully prepared instructions. The intelligence cache remained hidden at Eagle's Rest Summit, waiting for retrieval by someone who understood its critical importance to national security. Standing in the snow beside his brother's final command post, Elijah faced a choice that would define the rest of his own life. He could return to his hermit existence with the knowledge that Samuel had died a hero, or he could complete the mission that had cost his brother's life and finally bring meaning to 5 decades of separation and sacrifice. Eagle's Rest Summit stood against the morning sky like a granite monument to impossible challenges. At 11,000 feet, the peak demanded a full day's climb through terrain that had claimed experienced mountaineers under ideal conditions. With snow still falling intermittently and temperatures hovering near zero, the ascent would test every survival skill Elijah had learned during 50 years in the wilderness. But Samuel's instructions were precise, and the intelligence cache's location was marked with coordinates that left no room for interpretation. The summit's northwestern face contained a natural rock formation that would shelter the hidden materials from weather while remaining accessible to someone who knew exactly where to look. Elijah prepared for the climb with methodical care, drawing on decades of mountain experience to select equipment and plan routes that would maximize his chances of success. His age worked against him. 73 was far from ideal for technical climbing, but his intimate knowledge of these peaks provided advantages that younger men might lack. Samuel's detailed instructions included hand-drawn maps that showed the safest approach routes, along with alternative paths for emergency descent. His brother had obviously climbed Eagle's Rest multiple times, studying its challenges and developing strategies that balanced speed against safety. The maps contained notations about handholds, rest positions, and weather shelters that could only have come from extensive personal experience. The climb began before dawn, with Elijah following a faint game trail that wound through dense timber toward the mountain's lower slopes. His snowshoes provided flotation over fresh powder, but the increasing grade soon forced him to switch to crampons and begin the serious work of gaining elevation on steep terrain. Samuel's route planning proved masterful, as Elijah discovered rest positions and shelter spots marked exactly where fatigue and exposure threatened to become dangerous. His brother had anticipated the physical demands of the climb and positioned tactical advantages at precise intervals along the ascent route. The first major challenge came at 7,000 feet, where a vertical rock face required technical climbing skills that Elijah hadn't used in decades. Samuel's instructions included detailed guidance for this section, specifying handholds and anchor points that would allow safe passage even in winter conditions. As Elijah worked his way up the cliff face, he found himself following in Samuel's literal footsteps. Metal spikes driven into rock cracks decades earlier still provided secure anchor points for climbing ropes. His brother had prepared this route with the same attention to detail that had characterized 40 years of covert operations. The middle section of the climb tested Elijah's endurance as much as his technical skills. Samuel's maps guided him through a complex maze of couloirs and ridge systems where wrong turns could lead to impassable terrain or deadly exposure. The route planning demonstrated intimate knowledge of the mountain's seasonal conditions and weather patterns. At 9,000 feet, Elijah discovered Samuel's emergency cache supplies positioned for climbers who might need shelter or sustenance during difficult ascents. The cache contained high-energy food, medical supplies, and backup climbing gear, all preserved in waterproof containers that showed Samuel's foresight and preparation. The final approach to Eagle's Rest summit demanded everything Elijah had learned about mountain survival and technical climbing. Wind speeds increased dramatically above tree line, and the exposed rock faces required precise movement and absolute concentration. One mistake at this elevation would be fatal, with no possibility of rescue or recovery. Samuel's instructions proved invaluable during the summit approach, guiding Elijah around hidden dangers and toward the most secure climbing routes. His brother's experience was evident in every detail: the positioning of rest stops, the selection of protected routes, the identification of potential hazards that might not be obvious to less experienced climbers. The intelligence cache was hidden exactly where Samuel's coordinates indicated a natural rock shelter on the summit's northwestern face, protected from weather but accessible to someone following precise directions. The hiding place demonstrated both tactical thinking and practical mountain craft, positioned where casual climbers would never discover it, but authorized personnel could locate it efficiently. The cache itself was a masterpiece of concealment and preservation, Samuel had used military-grade waterproofing and protection systems to ensure that critical documents would survive decades of mountain weather without degradation. The container was carefully camouflaged, but marked with symbols that would identify its contents to authorized personnel. Inside the cache, Elijah found documentation that justified Samuel's ultimate sacrifice. Detailed intelligence about Soviet infiltration networks, complete with names, locations, operational procedures, and planned sabotage targets. The materials represented years of careful intelligence gathering by assets who'd risked everything to protect American interests during the Cold War's most dangerous period. But the cache contained more than military intelligence. Samuel had included personal documents that revealed his true feelings about family separation and his hope that someday his sacrifice would be understood and appreciated by those he'd protected through decades of secret service. A final letter, addressed to whoever retrieved the cache, explained Samuel's reasoning for his ultimate sacrifice and his instructions for ensuring that critical intelligence reached proper authorities without compromising national security or family safety. As Elijah secured the intelligence materials and prepared for descent, he realized that completing Samuel's mission would require more than physical courage. It would require accepting a role in events far larger than his hermit existence had ever encompassed, events that connected his family to the highest levels of national security and international conflict. The descent from Eagle's Rest proved even more treacherous than the climb, with loose snow concealing icy patches that could send an unwary mountaineer tumbling to his death. But Elijah carried more than Samuel's intelligence cache. He carried his brother's final instructions for contacting the handlers who would complete the mission that had cost so many lives. Samuel's protocols were elaborate but necessary, designed to ensure that critical intelligence reached proper authorities without exposing Elijah to the same dangers that had claimed his brother's life. The contact procedures involved a series of coded communications and security verification steps that would confirm both the intelligence's authenticity and the messenger's legitimate authorization to deliver it. Back at his cabin, Elijah followed Samuel's instructions with military precision. The first step involved using his own radio equipment to contact a specific frequency at predetermined times, transmitting a coded message that would identify him as Agent Phantom's family representative with critical materials requiring immediate attention. The response came within hours, a professional voice that spoke in careful phrases designed to verify Elijah's identity without revealing sensitive information over potentially compromised communications channels. This is Mountain Base responding to family transmission. Please confirm your relationship to our missing friend and describe the materials you believe require our attention. Following Samuel's script exactly, Elijah provided the verification codes and described the intelligence cache's contents using terms that would be meaningful to trained handlers while remaining cryptic to casual listeners. I am the older brother of your missing friend. I have recovered his final project containing information about timber industry problems and the people who were causing difficulties for everyone involved. The response demonstrated that Samuel's handlers had been waiting for exactly this type of contact. Understood, family representative. We have been expecting communication regarding your brother's final project. Please stand by for detailed instructions regarding secure transfer of materials. What followed was a complex procedure involving multiple verification steps designed to ensure that Elijah was legitimate and that the intelligence cache hadn't been compromised by enemy operatives. The handlers needed confirmation not just of the material's authenticity, but of Elijah's trustworthiness and his understanding of the security requirements involved. The verification process revealed the scope of Samuel's reputation within intelligence circles. When Elijah provided details about the cache's contents and location, the response carried a level of respect and emotion that suggested his brother had been regarded as more than just another operative. Agent Phantom was one of our most valuable assets. the handler explained during a secure communication session. His 40-year service record includes some of the most critical intelligence operations in Cold War history. The materials you've recovered represent his final contribution to national security, and we want to ensure they receive the recognition they deserve. The handlers arranged a secure meeting location where Elijah could transfer the intelligence materials under conditions that would protect both the documents and the people involved in their delivery. The site was chosen for its remoteness and defensive positions, characteristics that Samuel would have appreciated and approved. The meeting took place 3 days later at a remote airstrip that hadn't appeared on any map Elijah had ever seen. 2 men in civilian clothes arrived in an unmarked aircraft, bringing with them documentation that confirmed their authority and credentials for receiving classified materials from Agent Phantom's family. The lead handler, who introduced himself only as Mr. Davidson, reviewed the intelligence cache with obvious expertise and growing amazement at its scope and importance. Your brother succeeded in preventing one of the most significant sabotage operations planned against American infrastructure during the entire Cold War period, Davidson explained as he examined the documents. This intelligence will allow us to identify and counter Soviet networks that have been operating undetected for years. But the handlers brought more than professional gratitude. They brought official recognition of Samuel's extraordinary service record and his family's right to understand the true nature of his sacrifice. Agent Phantom will be posthumously awarded the Intelligence Star for exceptional service under hazardous conditions, Davidson announced. His 40-year record of covert operations saved countless American lives and protected national security interests that the public will never know existed. The formal recognition included documentation of Samuel's complete service record, his commendations and decorations, and official acknowledgement of his sacrifice in completing the mission that had cost his life. More importantly, it included government compensation for the family that had unknowingly supported his service through decades of separation and loss. The United States owes your family a debt that can never be fully repaid, Davidson continued. Your brother's willingness to maintain deep cover for 4 decades, including separation from loved ones, represents sacrifice of the highest order. This compensation represents the nation's gratitude for both his service and your family's unknowing contribution to his success. As the handlers prepared to depart with Samuel's final intelligence delivery, they provided Elijah with something he'd never expected to receive: official closure regarding his brother's disappearance and formal recognition of the heroic service that had kept America safe throughout the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. Agent Phantom's mission is complete, Davidson said as they shook hands beside the unmarked aircraft. Thanks to your courage in completing his final assignment, his sacrifice will protect American lives for generations to come. 6 months after that meeting at the remote airstrip, Elijah Boone stood in Arlington National Cemetery, watching honor guards fold an American flag with military precision. The ceremony was small but dignified. Family members, government officials, and a handful of intelligence operatives whose presence testified to Samuel's extraordinary service record. The medal presentation had taken place earlier in a secure government facility, where Samuel received posthumous recognition that would never be displayed publicly but would forever acknowledge his contribution to American security. The Intelligence Star, the nation's highest award for covert operations, represented 40 years of sacrifice that had kept enemies at bay during the Cold War's most dangerous period. But for Elijah, the most meaningful moment came when the cemetery honor guard presented him with the folded flag that had covered Samuel's symbolic casket. On behalf of a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your brother's honorable and faithful service to his country. The words carried weight that went far beyond ceremony. Samuel had finally received the recognition he deserved since 1918, acknowledgement that his service, both military and intelligence, had represented the finest traditions of American patriotism and sacrifice. The extended family members who attended the ceremony were distant relatives Elijah hadn't seen in decades, cousins and their children who'd grown up hearing stories about the two Boone brothers who'd disappeared into different kinds of wilderness after the Great War. Their presence at Samuel's funeral represented a reconnection that 50 years of isolation had made impossible, but death had somehow restored. "We always wondered what happened to you boys," his cousin Martha explained during the reception that followed the burial. "Mother used to say that the war took you both in different ways, but she never stopped hoping you'd find your way home eventually." The government compensation for Samuel's service had been substantial recognition not just of his individual sacrifice, but of the family's unknowing contribution to his success through decades of separation. Elijah had used the funds to establish something Samuel would have appreciated, a scholarship program for children of military families, particularly those whose parents served in classified positions that required family separation. The Samuel J. Boone Memorial Scholarship would ensure that other families wouldn't suffer financially from the kind of service that had kept Samuel away from home for 40 years. It represented a legacy that honored both his military courage and his lifelong dedication to protecting American interests through personal sacrifice. But the scholarship was only part of Elijah's commitment to honoring his brother's memory. He'd also made a decision that would have seemed impossible during his hermit years, returning to civilization and rebuilding the family connections that both brothers had abandoned through their different forms of exile. The old family farm had been sold decades earlier, but Elijah purchased a small house in Missoula where he could maintain connections with the extended family while still enjoying access to the mountains that had sheltered him for 50 years. The transition from hermit to community member proved easier than expected. His wilderness skills and quiet competence earned respect from neighbors who valued practical knowledge over social sophistication. More importantly, Elijah discovered that his years of solitude had given him something valuable to offer. Perspective on loss, patience developed through hardship, and understanding of how families could survive separation and find healing even after decades of silence. He became a regular visitor to veterans organizations, sharing Samuel's story with men who understood the complex relationships between duty and family, service and sacrifice. Samuel's example provided comfort to other families dealing with loved ones whose military service required secrecy and separation. "Your brother understood something important about service," explained a retired Army colonel who'd attended one of Elijah's presentations. "Sometimes protecting the people you love means staying away from them." Samuel spent 40 years keeping his family safe by keeping them distant, and that kind of sacrifice deserves recognition. The recognition extended beyond formal ceremonies and government acknowledgements. Samuel's grave in Arlington became a destination for intelligence operatives who wanted to pay respects to a colleague whose service had established standards for dedication and professionalism. The headstone bore only his name and military service dates, but those who knew the truth understood that it marked the resting place of one of America's greatest unsung heroes. For Elijah, the most profound change came in his relationship with memory itself. The mountains, that had once sheltered him from painful recollections, now served as reminders of Samuel's courage and the family bonds that had survived 50 years of separation. His trap lines took him past the aircraft wreckage where he'd discovered the truth about his brother, but instead of causing pain, the site had become a place of reflection and gratitude. On clear winter mornings, when snow sparkled like diamonds across the Bitterroot peaks, Elijah could almost feel Samuel's presence in the wind that carried scents of pine and possibility. His brother had found his way home after all, not through the reunion they'd both dreamed of, but through the understanding that love transcends death and service honors family, even when it requires separation. The compass Samuel had carried through war and exile now sat on Elijah's mantle, its needle still pointing steadily toward magnetic north. But Elijah had learned that true direction couldn't be found in any instrument it came from. understanding that home wasn't a place but a connection, that family wasn't proximity but commitment, and that some sacrifices created legacies that lasted longer than the lives that made them. Samuel had spent 40 years protecting a family that didn't know it needed protection, serving a country that couldn't acknowledge his service, and maintaining hope that love would eventually bridge any distance. His faith had been justified not through reunion in life, but through recognition in death, and the understanding that his sacrifice had meaning beyond his ability to witness its appreciation. Standing in the cemetery as autumn light filtered through ancient oaks, Elijah finally understood what his father had meant about finding direction. A man had to know where he stood before he could figure out where he was going. Samuel had always known where he stood between his family and the dangers that threatened them. And now, finally, everyone else knew it too.